The phone screen lit up at 11 at night, and Claire stared at it without touching it. Daniel's message said he would be late again, that a client dinner had run over, that she should not wait up. She had heard this sentence, or some version of it, more times than she could count. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and looked at the plate of food she had made for 2 people, now cooling under a sheet of foil meant for 1. This was not new. This had been happening for 3 years, ever since Daniel's promotion at the marketing firm downtown. At first, Claire told herself it was temporary, a season of hard work that would pass once he settled into the new role. But the season never ended. It simply became the shape of their marriage, a quiet agreement neither of them had spoken aloud. Daniel worked, and Claire waited. She was 31 years old, an interior designer with a growing client list, a woman who had once believed marriage meant being seen. Now she moved through her own home, like a guest who paid rent but was rarely acknowledged. She ate dinner alone most nights. She fell asleep before he came home, more nights than she could remember. On the nights he was home early, he sat with his laptop open, his eyes on a screen instead of on her. Claire walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, at the porch light of the house across from theirs, at a couple sitting together on their steps, laughing about something she could not hear. She used to laugh like that. She tried to remember the last time Daniel had asked her a real question about her day, not the automatic "how was work," but something that meant he was actually listening for the answer. She could not remember. In the bedroom, she changed into pajamas and lay down on her side of the bed, leaving his side untouched, the blanket still folded from that morning. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the first year of this slow disappearing act. Now there was only a tired, steady ache, the kind that lived in her chest and did not leave, even when she smiled at strangers, or clients, or her sister on the phone. Her sister, Bethany, had noticed the change before anyone else. Just last week, over coffee, Bethany had studied Claire's face and asked, gently, if everything was all right at home. Claire had given her usual answer, the one she always gave. Daniel's just busy. It's a busy season. It will get better. Bethany had not pushed, but her eyes had held a kind of worry that made Claire look away first. The truth was, Claire did not know if it would get better. She had asked Daniel to make time for them, more than once. She had suggested date nights, weekend trips, even something as small as eating dinner together without his phone on the table. Each time, he agreed with an easy nod, an easy promise, and each time the promise dissolved within days, buried under new deadlines and new excuses. She thought about the early years, when Daniel used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror before he left for work, small messages written in dry erase marker that made her laugh before her coffee had even finished brewing. She thought about the trip they had taken to the coast for their first anniversary, how he had held her hand the entire drive and told her she was the best decision he had ever made. That man felt like someone she used to know, not someone she was still married to. Around midnight, she heard his key in the door. She lay still, eyes closed, listening to his footsteps move through the house, the refrigerator opening, the television turning on low in the living room. He did not come to check on her. He rarely did anymore. She used to wait for the sound of the bedroom door, used to hope he would slip in quietly and kiss her forehead, even if she was already sleeping. That habit, too, had faded somewhere in the last 3 years, disappearing so slowly she could not point to the exact day it stopped. She opened her eyes in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she had a big presentation for a client, a large home renovation project she had spent weeks designing. She used to tell Daniel about her projects in detail, sketching ideas on napkins at dinner, asking his opinion on paint colors and furniture layouts. Now she kept these details to herself, storing them away like a secret, because sharing them with someone who was not truly listening felt worse than not sharing them at all. The next morning, Claire woke before her alarm. Daniel was still asleep beside her, having come to bed sometime after 2. She showered, dressed in a sharp gray blazer, and made coffee for herself alone. She thought about waking him, about asking if he wanted breakfast, but she already knew the answer. He would mumble something about being tired, about needing 15 more minutes, and those 15 minutes would turn into him rushing out the door with a granola bar in his hand and a rushed kiss on her cheek that felt more like a habit than an act of love. She left for her presentation without waking him. The meeting went well. Her client, a warm older woman named Margaret who was renovating her late husband's childhood home, loved every idea Claire presented. Margaret held her hand at the end of the meeting and told her she had a gift, that she could see love in every detail of the design. Claire smiled and thanked her, but the compliment landed strangely, because she could not remember the last time she had felt loved herself. Driving home that afternoon, she passed a small park where families were having picnics, where a young couple sat together under a tree, her head resting on his shoulder. Claire slowed the car without meaning to, watching them for a moment longer than she should have. She used to have that. She still remembered what it felt like, the weight of being someone's whole attention. When she got home, the house was empty. Daniel had left for work hours ago, leaving no note, no message, nothing to suggest he had thought of her at all that morning. Claire set her bag down and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, feeling the silence of the house settle around her like something heavy. She thought about calling him just to hear his voice, just to feel some small connection, but she stopped herself. She was tired of being the only one reaching. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual, around 7, and Claire felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe tonight would be different. She had made a real dinner, chicken with roasted vegetables, the kind of meal they used to share slowly, with conversation and wine and laughter. She set the table for 2 and lit a candle, feeling almost foolish for hoping. Daniel walked in, dropped his bag by the door, and immediately reached for his phone, scrolling through messages as he sat down at the table. Claire watched him for a moment, waiting for him to look up, to notice the effort she had made. He did not. He ate quickly, still glancing at his screen between bites, mentioning something about a project deadline the following week, about needing to leave early the next few mornings. Claire nodded along, though something inside her quietly closed like a door. After dinner, he thanked her for the meal, kissed the top of her head, and disappeared into his home office to finish work. Claire cleared the table alone, blew out the candle that had barely been noticed, and sat on the couch with a book she did not read. She thought about her wedding day, about the vows they had spoken, about the promise to cherish each other through all seasons. She wondered when cherishing had quietly turned into coexisting, when partnership had become something closer to loneliness, shared under one roof. Later that night, unable to sleep, Claire walked to the guest room and sat by the window, looking out at the stars. She thought about her own worth, about the woman she had been before this slow fading began, confident and full of plans and dreams she used to share eagerly with the man she loved. She wondered if that woman was still inside her somewhere, waiting to be noticed again, or if 3 years of being overlooked had quietly worn her down into someone smaller. She did not have an answer yet. But somewhere in that quiet room, in that long and lonely night, a small seed of something new began to take root inside her, something she could not yet name, but something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like the beginning of a decision. Claire began to notice the small things more clearly now, the things she had trained herself to overlook for the sake of peace. The way Daniel checked his phone before he checked on her. The way he remembered every deadline at work but forgot the date of her mother's passing. A day that had once meant he would hold her a little longer without being asked. The way he could describe every detail of a client's marketing budget but could not tell her what color she had painted the hallway 2 months ago, even though he walked through it every single day. It was a Tuesday evening, when the weight of it all became too heavy to carry quietly. Claire had been promoted that afternoon, moved into a senior design role she had worked toward for 2 years. She had imagined this moment countless times, imagined coming home and sharing the news over a celebratory dinner, imagined Daniel lifting her off her feet the way he used to when good things happened to either of them. Instead, she came home to an empty house. She waited. She texted him the news, adding an exclamation point she almost regretted, as if trying too hard to make the moment feel as big to him as it felt to her. An hour passed before he replied. 2 words. That's great. No call. No question about how it happened, what it meant, what she planned to do to celebrate. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand, staring at those 2 words, feeling something inside her go very still and very quiet. She thought about calling her sister, but she did not want to hear the concern in Bethany's voice again, did not want to be reminded of how visible her loneliness had become to everyone, but the man who was supposed to notice it first. Daniel came home close to 9 that night, smelling faintly of coffee and the particular tiredness of long meetings. He kissed her cheek in passing, congratulated her again with the same flat warmth as his text message, and asked what was for dinner. Claire told him she had not made anything, that she had been waiting to celebrate with him. He looked briefly apologetic, said he had already eaten a sandwich at the office, and disappeared to change out of his work clothes. Claire sat alone in the kitchen, the promotion that should have been one of the happiest moments of her year, now feeling small and unwitnessed, folded quietly into the growing pile of things Daniel had missed. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself in different forms. Claire's friend group organized a dinner to celebrate her new role, and Daniel promised he would come, only to send a message 20 minutes before the reservation saying something had come up at work. Claire sat at the table, surrounded by people who cared enough to show up, and felt, for the first time, a strange mixture of gratitude and grief. Grateful for the friends who noticed her, grieving the husband who did not. Her friend Lauren, sitting beside her at the dinner, leaned over at one point and asked quietly if Daniel was always this busy. Claire gave her usual practiced answer about deadlines and demanding clients, but Lauren's expression told her the excuse had worn thin, not just for Claire, but for everyone watching from the outside. At home, the silence between Claire and Daniel deepened, not through arguments, but through absence. They existed in the same house like two people sharing a waiting room, polite, distant, waiting for something neither of them named. Claire began going to bed earlier, not because she was tired, but because the alternative was sitting alone in a living room while Daniel worked in another room, and the loneliness of being awake together, with no real connection, was somehow worse than being alone entirely. She started noticing things about herself changing too. She used to hum while she cooked. She used to call her sister just to talk about nothing in particular. Now she moved through her days quietly, efficiently, saving her warmth for clients and friends, because there seemed to be no place for it at home. One afternoon, while organizing old photographs for a design project inspiration board, Claire came across pictures from their wedding. She studied her own face in the photographs, remembering the joy she had felt, the certainty that she had chosen the right person, that they would build a life full of shared moments and mutual care. She looked at Daniel's face beside hers in the pictures, young and eager, his eyes fixed only on her. She wondered where that man had gone, and more painfully, she wondered if he had ever truly existed the way she remembered, or if she had simply been in love with a version of him she had hoped he would always be. That night, she brought the photographs to dinner, hoping to spark some memory, some feeling, in Daniel. She spread a few of them across the table as he sat down, his laptop bag still on his shoulder. He glanced at the photographs, smiled faintly, said something about how young they looked, and then set his bag down and reached for his phone to check a work message. Claire watched him do this without reacting, without saying a word, because she had said the words before, many times, in many forms, and each time they had changed nothing. She gathered the photographs quietly and put them away, understanding, in a way she had not fully allowed herself to understand before, that reminders of the past would not fix what was broken in the present. She began to keep a small notebook, tucked into her nightstand drawer, where she wrote down not complaints, but observations. The nights Daniel came home late, the moments he missed, the conversations that ended in silence because he was not truly listening. She did not know why she started the notebook, only that writing things down made them feel real, in a way that simply enduring them did not. Weeks passed this way, each one nearly identical to the last. Claire poured herself into her work, finding a strange comfort in the one part of her life where she still felt fully seen, fully valued. Her clients admired her attention to detail, her ability to listen closely to what they wanted, and translate it into something beautiful. She wished, quietly, that someone would listen to her the same way. One evening, arriving home from a long day, Claire found Daniel already there, an unusual occurrence. For a brief moment, hope flickered in her chest, but the hope faded quickly when she realized he was preparing for a work trip, packing a suitcase with the same distracted efficiency he brought to everything else in their life together. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he would be gone for 5 days, a conference in another city. Claire nodded, asked no questions, offered no protest, because she had learned that protests changed nothing, only extended the discomfort of an argument that would end with another empty promise. As she watched him zip his suitcase closed, she felt something shift inside her, subtle but unmistakable, like a seam quietly tearing loose in fabric that had been stretched too thin for too long. She was not yet ready to name what that shift meant, but she felt it, clearly and completely, and she carried it with her long after Daniel had left for his trip, long after the house had settled back into its familiar, lonely quiet. Daniel's trip was only supposed to last 5 days, but on the third day, Claire's father called her with news that made her hands shake. Her father, Gerald, had been rushed to the hospital after a sudden collapse at his home, and doctors suspected he would need surgery within the next 24 hours. Claire drove to the hospital immediately, her heart pounding, her mind racing through every possible outcome. She called Daniel from the hospital waiting room, her voice trembling as she explained what was happening. She asked him, as gently as she could manage under the weight of her fear, if there was any way he could come home early, even just for a day, to be with her while she waited for news about her father. Daniel was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before he said that the conference had an important closing session the next morning, one that mattered for a project he had been leading for months. He told her he was sorry, that he wished he could be there, that he would call as often as he could. Claire sat in the hospital chair after the call ended, staring at the phone in her hand, feeling a kind of numbness spread through her chest that was almost worse than the fear she had felt moments before. Around her, other families sat together, holding hands, comforting each other, and Claire realized she was completely alone. She called her sister, and Bethany arrived within the hour, dropping everything to be by her side. Bethany held her hand through the long, uncertain hours, brought her coffee she did not drink, and stayed silent when silence was needed, and spoke gently when words were needed instead. It was Bethany who sat beside her in the surgical waiting room until nearly midnight, when the surgeon finally emerged to say that Gerald's surgery had gone well, that he would need time to recover but would be fine. Claire cried then, finally, the tears she had been holding back for hours spilling over all at once, relief and exhaustion and something else too, something that felt like grief for a different kind of loss entirely. Bethany held her without asking questions, and in that embrace, Claire felt more supported than she had felt from her own husband in longer than she wanted to admit. Daniel called the next morning, his voice full of relief when he heard that Gerald was recovering. He apologized again for not being there, promised he would make it up to her, said he would come home as soon as the conference ended in 2 more days. Claire listened to his voice, familiar and yet somehow distant, and found herself unable to summon the anger she had expected to feel. Instead, there was only a quiet, settled clarity, the kind that comes after a long fever finally breaks. She realized, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of untouched tea in front of her, that she had been waiting for years for Daniel to show up in the ways that mattered, and each time he had chosen something else instead. Work, deadlines, conferences. Somewhere along the way, without ever making a single dramatic decision, he had chosen those things over her, again and again, until the pattern had become the truth of their marriage. She thought of the notebook in her nightstand drawer, filled with quiet observations she had gathered over months. She thought of the promotion he had barely acknowledged, the dinners he had missed, the nights she had fallen asleep waiting for him to notice her. She thought of her father's surgery, of sitting alone in that waiting room while her husband chose a closing session over her fear. When Daniel finally returned home 2 days later, he arrived with a bouquet of flowers and an apology that sounded rehearsed, the kind of apology given, not because it came from deep reflection, but because it was expected. He held her for a long moment in the doorway, told her he loved her, told her things would be different from now on. Claire let him hold her. She even, for a moment, allowed herself to believe him, because believing him was easier than facing what she had begun to understand about their marriage. But that night, lying awake beside him as he slept soundly, unaware of the storm quietly gathering in her heart, Claire made a decision that would change everything. She was tired of being told things would be different. She had heard those words too many times to trust them anymore. What she needed now was not another promise, but proof, and if that proof did not come, she needed to be honest with herself about what that meant for her future. Over the following days, Claire watched Daniel closely, not with hope this time, but with clear, unclouded eyes. She noticed how quickly his renewed attentiveness faded, how within a week he was back to checking his phone at dinner, back to late nights at the office, back to the same distracted distance that had defined the last 3 years of their marriage. The flowers he had brought home wilted on the kitchen counter, and Claire found herself unable to summon the energy to replace them with fresh ones. She began to speak with her father's recovery as a kind of turning point in her own thinking, not because his surgery had been about her, but because sitting in that waiting room alone had shown her, with painful clarity, what her life would look like if nothing changed. She thought about growing older this way, about facing every difficulty alone, while Daniel remained physically present but emotionally absent, and the thought filled her with a quiet, resolute sadness that hardened, slowly, into determination. One evening, several weeks after her father's surgery, Claire sat Daniel down at the kitchen table and told him, calmly and clearly, that their marriage was not working the way it should. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply laid out, with the same precision she used in her design presentations, the pattern she had lived through for 3 years, the missed moments, the empty promises, the quiet loneliness that had grown between them despite living under the same roof. Daniel listened, his face shifting through surprise, and then defensiveness, and then, finally, something that looked almost like understanding. He apologized again, more sincerely this time, and asked what he could do to fix things. Claire told him, honestly, that she did not know anymore, that she had asked for change so many times that she no longer trusted her own hope. They agreed, that night, to try counseling, to make a real effort to repair what had quietly broken between them. Claire wanted to believe this would work. She wanted, more than anything, to find her way back to the marriage she had once believed in. But even as she agreed to try, a small, steady voice inside her had already begun preparing for the possibility that trying would not be enough. The counseling sessions began on a rainy Thursday afternoon, in a small office with soft lighting, and a therapist named Diane who had a calm, steady voice that put Claire at ease within the first few minutes. Daniel sat beside her, stiff and uncertain, clearly unused to speaking about his feelings in any structured way. Claire watched him fumble through his first attempts to explain himself, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps this process would finally break through the walls that had built up between them. For the first 2 weeks, something shifted. Daniel came home earlier. He put his phone away during dinner, at least most nights. He asked Claire questions about her day, and seemed, for the first time in years, to actually listen to her answers. Claire allowed herself to relax slightly, to believe that maybe the notebook in her nightstand drawer would remain unopened, that maybe this chapter of neglect was finally closing. But habits built over 3 years do not disappear in 3 weeks. By the start of the second month, Daniel's early nights began slipping back into late ones. A big project at work demanded his attention, he explained, and counseling sessions were pushed from once a week to once every 2 weeks, and then, eventually, skipped altogether some weeks due to his schedule. Claire noticed the slide happening in real time, watched the same pattern reassert itself despite everyone's best intentions, and felt something inside her grow quietly resigned. During one particular session, Diane asked Daniel directly what he believed Claire needed most from him. Daniel thought for a long moment before answering that he believed she needed him to provide for their future, to work hard so they could build a comfortable life together. Diane turned to Claire and asked if that answer matched what she needed. Claire, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest, said that she had never doubted Daniel's ability to provide. What she needed, she explained, was his presence, his attention, the simple experience of being noticed and valued in the small moments of everyday life, not just in grand gestures or financial security. Daniel looked genuinely surprised by this answer, as though the distinction had never fully occurred to him before. It was, in its own way, a small breakthrough, a moment where Claire felt truly heard for the first time in longer than she could remember. She left that session feeling lighter than she had in months, cautiously hopeful that real change might finally be within reach. That hope lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th day, Claire's design firm hosted an evening gala to celebrate a major project completion, one Claire herself had led from start to finish. She had been looking forward to the event for weeks, had chosen a dress carefully, had imagined Daniel standing beside her, proud, present, engaged in a moment that mattered deeply to her professional life. She reminded him about the gala every day that week, marked it clearly on the calendar they shared, sent him a message the morning of with the time and location. At 6 in the evening, as she finished getting ready, she received a text from Daniel saying an urgent client issue had come up, that he needed to stay late to handle it, that he was sorry, and would try to make it if he could get away in time. Claire stood in front of the mirror, fully dressed, her makeup done, her hope quietly deflating, as she read the message twice, then a third time, as though rereading it might change its meaning. She attended the gala alone. Her colleagues complimented her work, raised toasts in her honor, and Claire smiled through it all, accepting congratulations with practiced grace, even as a familiar ache settled in her chest. Margaret, the client from the home renovation project, attended the gala as a guest and found Claire near the end of the evening, taking her hand warmly and telling her how proud she should be of everything she had built. Claire thanked her, grateful for the kindness, but the words landed against the hollow space, where she had hoped Daniel's presence would be instead. Daniel never made it to the gala. He arrived home near midnight, apologetic, explaining the situation with his client in detailed, earnest terms, clearly believing his explanation would soften the disappointment. Claire listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him, quietly but firmly, that she understood work sometimes required sacrifice, but that this had stopped being about one missed event a long time ago. This was about a pattern, she explained, one that counseling had not changed, one that promises had not changed, one that seemed unlikely to change no matter how many conversations they had. Daniel tried to argue that he was trying, that these things took time, that she needed to be patient. Claire, for the first time in their marriage, did not soften her position to keep the peace. She told him that patience without change was simply another word for acceptance, and she was no longer willing to accept a marriage that left her feeling invisible in her own life. The conversation that followed was the most honest one they had shared in years. Claire spoke about the notebook she had kept, reading a few entries aloud, each one a small, specific example of a moment he had missed, a moment where she had needed him, and he had chosen something else. Daniel sat in stunned silence as the entries piled up, month after month, evidence of a pattern he had convinced himself was less significant than it truly was. By the time she finished, Daniel's face had changed entirely, the defensive posture replaced by something that looked, finally, like genuine grief. He asked her, his voice cracking slightly, what she wanted him to do. Claire told him, honestly, that she did not know if there was anything left to do, that she had spent 3 years hoping for change that never fully arrived, and she was not sure she had the strength to keep hoping. They did not resolve anything that night. They sat together in a heavy, exhausted silence until sleep finally took them both, each retreating to their own side of the bed, farther apart than ever despite lying only inches from each other. Over the following weeks, Claire continued attending counseling, continued going through the motions of trying, but something inside her had quietly shifted beyond repair. She began to notice, with growing clarity, that she was no longer waiting for Daniel to change. She was simply waiting for herself to become ready for what came next. She started saving a small amount of money each month into an account Daniel did not know about, not out of deception, but out of a growing instinct for self-protection she had never needed before. She began spending more time with Bethany, more time with friends who had quietly supported her through the hardest parts of the last 3 years, rebuilding a sense of self that existed independently of her marriage. One evening, sitting alone in her car, after a particularly difficult counseling session, Claire finally allowed herself to think the thought she had been avoiding for months. She thought about what her life might look like without Daniel, not with anger or bitterness, but with a strange, quiet curiosity. For the first time in a long while, that thought did not frighten her. It felt, instead, like the first breath of air after being underwater for far too long. The decision, when it finally arrived, did not come as a sudden explosion of anger. It came quietly, the way morning light arrives after a long night, gradual and undeniable. Claire woke one Saturday in early autumn and understood, with complete certainty, that she was ready to leave. She did not tell Daniel that morning. She simply began, in small and careful ways, to prepare. She contacted a lawyer recommended by a friend, a woman named Patricia who specialized in family matters, and who spoke to Claire with a gentle practicality that helped steady her nerves. Patricia walked her through what separation would look like, what she needed to consider financially and legally, and Claire listened carefully, taking notes in the same notebook that had once held only quiet observations of neglect. She found a small apartment across town, modest but bright, with large windows that reminded her of the kind of light she used to chase in her design work. She signed the lease under her own name, using savings she had quietly built over the past several months, and told no one except Bethany, who helped her carry boxes of essentials over during the days Daniel worked long hours at the office. Claire moved slowly and deliberately, careful not to disrupt Daniel's routine in ways that would cause him to notice too soon. Part of her recognized the strangeness of this caution, the instinct to protect a marriage she had already decided to leave. But old habits of consideration did not disappear simply because a decision had been made. She wanted to leave with dignity, without drama, in a way that reflected the woman she had become, rather than the anger she sometimes felt simmering beneath her calm exterior. During this time, Daniel seemed to sense a shift in her, though he could not name it. He began coming home earlier again, bringing home flowers unprompted, suggesting weekend outings he had never suggested before. Claire recognized these gestures for what they were, not a true transformation, but a reaction to sensing distance, an instinct to hold on tighter the moment he felt something slipping away. She accepted the flowers politely. She joined him on a Saturday outing to the farmer's market, walking beside him through familiar stalls, feeling strangely detached from a scene that once would have felt like happiness. She thought, during that outing, about how easy it might have been to stay, to let his sudden attentiveness convince her that things could finally be different. But she had learned, painfully, that attentiveness born from fear of loss rarely lasted longer than the fear itself. She had seen this pattern before, in the weeks following her father's surgery, in the early days of counseling. Each time, the change had faded once the immediate threat passed. She no longer trusted these bursts of effort to signal something lasting. 3 weeks after making her decision, everything was ready. The apartment was furnished with the essentials, the lease was signed. Her lawyer had prepared the necessary documents. Claire chose a Tuesday evening to have the conversation, a day with no work obligations for either of them, a quiet evening where they could speak without the pressure of anywhere else to be. She sat Daniel down at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared thousands of meals, some joyful, many silent, and told him, as gently and honestly as she could, that she had decided to leave. She explained that this was not a punishment, not an attempt to force change through drastic action, but a recognition that she had spent 3 years hoping for a partnership that had not materialized, and she could no longer keep hoping at the expense of her own well-being. Daniel's reaction moved through several stages in the span of a single conversation. First, disbelief, as though the words did not fully register. Then, desperate bargaining, promises of immediate and lasting change, offers to quit his current job if that was what it took, offers to attend counseling more consistently, offers to do anything she asked. Claire listened to each promise with a heavy heart, recognizing in his desperation the same patterns she had witnessed so many times before. Effort that arrived only in response to consequence, never proactively, never simply because she deserved it. She told him, as kindly as she could manage, that she appreciated his willingness to change now, but that she needed more than promises made under pressure. She needed to know, for herself, what her life felt like when she was not constantly waiting, constantly hoping, constantly absorbing disappointment in silence. She told him she was not asking for a divorce immediately, only for space, time to think clearly, away from the patterns that had defined their last 3 years together. Daniel's desperation eventually gave way to a quiet, defeated sadness that was, in some ways, harder for Claire to witness than his earlier reactions. He asked her where she would go, and she told him about the apartment, watching his face absorb the reality that this was not a spontaneous decision, but a carefully planned departure, one that had been building for weeks without his knowledge. That night, Claire packed the last of her belongings while Daniel sat in the living room, silent, staring at nothing in particular. She did not ask him to help her carry the boxes to her car, and he did not offer. There was no anger in the silence between them, only the heavy exhaustion of two people who had drifted so far from each other that reaching back across the distance no longer felt possible. As she loaded the final box into her car, Claire paused for a moment in the driveway, looking back at the house that had been her home for 5 years. She thought about the early happiness, the wedding day, the small notes on the bathroom mirror, the trip to the coast. She thought about how slowly and quietly those things had faded, replaced by absence, disguised as busyness, by loneliness, disguised as marriage. She got into her car and drove away without looking back a second time, tears finally falling freely down her face, not tears of regret, but tears of release, the kind that come when a burden carried too long is finally set down. Daniel remained in the house that night, sitting in the same spot on the couch for hours after she left, staring at the space where her car had been parked in the driveway just hours before. He called her twice, and she did not answer either time. He sent a message asking if she had arrived safely at wherever she was staying, and Claire, unable to ignore basic decency even in the midst of everything, replied simply that she was safe and needed time before speaking further. He set the phone down and looked around the empty house, noticing for the first time in a long while just how quiet it truly was. How much of the warmth that used to fill these rooms had come from Claire's presence. A presence he had, without ever intending to, slowly stopped noticing until it was completely gone. The days that followed Claire's departure moved strangely for Daniel, both painfully slow and disorienting in their sudden emptiness. He woke each morning expecting to hear the sound of her moving through the kitchen, expecting the smell of coffee she always made even on days she rushed out the door. Instead, he found silence, a house that felt too large for one person, rooms that echoed with the absence of a presence he had, somewhere along the way, stopped truly seeing. At work, he found it difficult to concentrate. Colleagues noticed the change in him, the distracted pauses in meetings, the way he stared at his phone more often, waiting for a message from Claire that rarely came. His assistant, a kind woman named Priya, asked him gently one afternoon if everything was all right at home. Daniel gave a vague answer about needing some personal time, unwilling to admit, even to himself fully, the scope of what had happened. He replayed their conversation from that Tuesday evening, over and over in his mind, searching for the exact moment things had gone wrong, as though pinpointing a single mistake might offer some path toward fixing it. But the more he searched, the more he realized there was no single mistake to find. There had been hundreds of small choices, made over 3 years, each one small enough to seem forgivable in isolation, but together forming a pattern so consistent that Claire had finally run out of hope that it would change. He reached out to their mutual friends, hoping for insight, hoping perhaps that someone could tell him this was a temporary reaction, that Claire simply needed space and would return once she had processed her frustrations. Instead, he found himself met with a kind of gentle honesty that stung more than outright anger would have. Lauren, Claire's close friend, told him directly that she had watched Claire grow quieter and sadder over the past 3 years, that she had wondered privately when Claire would finally reach her breaking point. Daniel absorbed this information with a growing sense of shame, realizing that people outside his marriage had seen clearly what he himself had failed to notice from the inside. He called his own brother, Nathan, one evening, needing someone to talk to who would not judge him too harshly. Nathan listened patiently as Daniel explained the situation, and when Daniel finished, Nathan was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He reminded Daniel of a conversation they had shared over a year earlier, at a family gathering, when Nathan had gently commented that Claire seemed tired, distant, not quite herself. Daniel had brushed the comment aside at the time, insisting everything was fine, that Claire was simply busy with work. Now, hearing his brother repeat that memory back to him, Daniel understood how many warning signs he had missed or dismissed, each one a small opportunity to change course that he had let pass by unnoticed. Nathan's words that night were not harsh, but they were honest, in a way Daniel needed to hear. He told Daniel that love was not proven through grand gestures made in moments of crisis, but through the accumulation of small, consistent acts of attention over time. He told him that Claire had likely been asking for exactly that, small, consistent attention, for years, and that Daniel's failure had not been a lack of love, but a failure to translate that love into the kind of daily presence a marriage required to survive. Daniel sat with those words long after the call ended, staring out at the dark street through the living room window, feeling the full weight of realization settle over him for the first time. He began to understand that his neglect had not been a single decision, but a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each individually forgivable, together devastating. He thought about the promotion Claire had earned, the gala she had attended alone, the hospital waiting room where she had sat by herself while he chose a closing conference session over her fear for her father's life. Each memory arrived with sharper clarity now, no longer softened by the excuses he had once told himself. He saw, finally, the pattern Claire had described in their last honest conversation, The years of small absences that had built into an unbearable weight she could no longer carry alone. Over the following days, Daniel began making changes, not to win Claire back immediately, but because he recognized, finally, that these changes were necessary, regardless of whether their marriage survived. He spoke to his manager about adjusting his workload, about delegating certain responsibilities that had consumed so many of his evenings and weekends. He began attending individual counseling sessions of his own, separate from the couples counseling they had previously attended together, wanting to understand more deeply why he had allowed work to become such an effective shield against genuine emotional presence. During these sessions, he confronted uncomfortable truths about himself, including the realization that work had, in some ways, become an easier space to exist in than his marriage. Work offered clear metrics of success, immediate validation, problems with defined solutions. His marriage, by contrast, required a kind of emotional vulnerability and sustained attention that he had never learned to prioritize, having grown up in a household where his own father had modeled a similar pattern of distant, work-focused parenting. This realization did not excuse his behavior, but it helped him understand it, and understanding, his therapist explained gently, was often the first necessary step toward genuine change, rather than performative promises made in moments of panic. Daniel began writing Claire letters, not to send immediately, but to process his own thoughts honestly on paper. He wrote about the early years of their marriage, about what he remembered loving most about her, about the specific moments he now recognized as failures on his part. He filled pages with memories he had nearly forgotten, the note left on the bathroom mirror all those years ago, the coastal trip for their first anniversary. Small, joyful details that had once defined their relationship before work had slowly crowded them out. He did not send Claire these letters immediately. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that sending them too soon would only add pressure to a situation already heavy with pain. Instead, he continued the slow, difficult work of examining himself honestly, waiting for the right moment, if such a moment ever came, to share what he had learned. Meanwhile, in her new apartment across town, Claire began the quiet process of rebuilding a life centered entirely around herself, a life where her needs and attention were no longer secondary to someone else's schedule. The apartment Claire had chosen sat on the third floor of a converted brick building, its large windows facing east so that morning light poured across the wooden floors each day, waking her gently even before her alarm sounded. She had chosen the space partly for its light, remembering how much she used to value light in her design work, and partly because it felt entirely, unmistakably hers, untouched by years of quiet disappointment. In the first few weeks, she focused on small rituals that had once brought her joy, but had slowly disappeared during her marriage. She began cooking elaborate meals just for herself, not out of loneliness, but out of a rediscovered pleasure in the act of creating something beautiful without needing anyone else's approval to enjoy it. She played music while she cooked, sometimes singing along quietly, rediscovering a lightness in herself she had almost forgotten existed. She returned to painting, a hobby she had abandoned years earlier, when work and marriage had consumed most of her free time. She bought a set of canvases and paints, setting up a small corner of her living room as a makeshift studio, filling her new home with color and texture that reflected her own taste entirely, without compromise, without needing to accommodate anyone else's preferences. Bethany visited often during these early weeks, bringing wine and takeout, sitting with Claire on the small balcony overlooking the street below, listening as Claire processed the enormity of the change she had made. Bethany never pushed her toward any particular decision about Daniel, understanding intuitively that Claire needed space to arrive at her own conclusions, without outside pressure influencing the process. At work, Claire's colleagues noticed a subtle shift in her energy, though most did not know the reason behind it. Margaret, still occasionally in touch after their successful renovation project, commented one afternoon that Claire seemed to be glowing lately, more present, more engaged than she had been during their earlier meetings months before. Claire smiled at the observation, recognizing its truth even as she kept the full details of her personal life private. It was through her work, unexpectedly, that she first crossed paths with Marcus. Marcus worked as an architect for a firm that frequently collaborated with Claire's design company on larger renovation projects. She had heard his name mentioned in passing during previous projects, but had never worked with him directly, until a new assignment brought them together, a historic building downtown being converted into modern loft apartments, while preserving its original architectural character. Their first meeting took place in a conference room filled with blueprints and material samples, and Claire noticed immediately the careful, thoughtful way Marcus approached the project, asking detailed questions, not just about structural elements, but about how the space would feel to the people who eventually lived there. He listened closely when Claire spoke, taking notes, asking follow-up questions that showed he had genuinely absorbed what she said, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. It was a small thing, this quality of listening, but Claire noticed it immediately, perhaps because she had spent 3 years without experiencing it in her closest relationship. She found herself, over the following weeks of collaboration, looking forward to their project meetings, not out of romantic interest initially, but simply because working alongside someone so genuinely present felt like a small daily gift after so long without it. Marcus, for his part, found himself equally drawn to Claire's careful, thoughtful approach to design, her ability to balance beauty with practicality, her clear passion for creating spaces that felt warm and lived in rather than simply impressive. During one late afternoon meeting, as they reviewed final material selections together, Marcus asked Claire, almost casually, what had first drawn her to interior design as a career. Claire found herself sharing more than she had planned, talking about her childhood home, about a mother who had taught her that a well-designed space could make people feel truly at home in their own lives. Marcus listened with genuine interest, sharing in turn his own story, how he had grown up watching his father restore old buildings, developing a deep respect for architecture that honored history while still serving modern needs. Their conversation extended well beyond the scope of their project, neither of them quite noticing how much time had passed, until the building's cleaning staff gently reminded them the office was closing for the evening. As their working relationship continued over the following weeks, Claire began noticing small things about Marcus that felt significant precisely because of how ordinary they seemed. He remembered details from previous conversations, referencing them naturally in later discussions. He asked about her weekend plans on Fridays, and actually remembered her answers the following Monday. When she mentioned, in passing, a difficult client interaction, he asked thoughtful follow-up questions the next time they spoke, showing he had genuinely thought about what she shared, rather than simply forgetting it once the conversation ended. These small moments of attention, so simple and yet so rare in her recent experience, began to mean more to Claire than she initially expected. She found herself, during quiet moments at home, thinking about their conversations, replaying small exchanges that had made her smile during an otherwise ordinary workday. She was careful, however, not to move too quickly in her own heart. She was still, technically, married, still processing the end of a 5-year relationship, still working through complicated feelings about Daniel that ranged from lingering affection to quiet resentment to a kind of grief for the life she had once imagined they would build together. She did not want to rush toward Marcus as a way of avoiding that grief, understanding instinctively that healing needed to happen on its own timeline, separate from any new connection, however promising it might feel. Still, she could not deny that something had shifted within her since meeting him, a quiet reminder that the kind of attention and presence she had craved for years was not simply a fantasy, but something real people were capable of offering naturally, without needing to be asked or reminded or begged for it. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting about the loft project, Marcus asked Claire if she would like to continue their conversation over coffee at a small shop near the office. Claire hesitated for only a moment, before agreeing, telling herself it was simply a continuation of their professional collaboration, even as some quieter part of her recognized it as something more. The coffee shop sat on a quiet corner a few blocks from the office, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside meeting the cool evening air outside. Claire and Marcus found a small table near the back, away from the noise of the espresso machine, and settled into a conversation that felt, from its very first moments, easier than she had expected. Marcus asked about her family, and Claire found herself telling him about her father's recent surgery, about how frightened she had been during those long hours in the hospital waiting room. She mentioned, briefly and without elaborating too much, that she had been going through a difficult time in her personal life, and Marcus, sensing the sensitivity of the subject, did not press for details. Instead, he simply told her that he was sorry she had been carrying so much alone, and something about the simplicity of that response, unhurried and genuine, made Claire's eyes sting unexpectedly. She changed the subject before her emotions could rise further, asking him instead about his own life, his own family. Marcus spoke warmly about his parents, still married after nearly 40 years, still, according to him, finding small ways to surprise each other, even after 4 decades together. He mentioned that his father still left notes for his mother most mornings before leaving for work, a habit Marcus said he hoped to carry into his own future relationships someday. Claire felt something tighten in her chest at this detail, remembering the notes Daniel used to leave on their bathroom mirror in the early years of their marriage, notes that had stopped so long ago she had nearly forgotten they had ever existed at all. She did not share this memory with Marcus, not wanting to introduce Daniel into a conversation that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely free of the weight she carried from her marriage. Their coffee turned into a 2-hour conversation, covering everything from favorite childhood memories to opinions on architecture and design philosophy, to small, funny stories about difficult clients they had each worked with over the years. Claire laughed more freely that evening than she had in longer than she could remember, a genuine, easy laughter that surprised her with how natural it felt. As the evening wound down and they walked together toward the parking garage, Marcus asked, carefully and without pressure, if she would like to have dinner with him sometime. As friends, he clarified gently, respecting whatever boundaries she needed, given what she had hinted about her personal situation. Claire appreciated the care in how he phrased the invitation, the absence of any assumption or expectation, and she agreed, telling him she would look forward to it. Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened steadily, built on a foundation of genuine interest and mutual respect rather than any rushed romantic intensity. Marcus never asked directly about her marriage, allowing Claire to share details at her own pace. And when she finally did explain, during a quiet dinner several weeks later, the full story of her separation from Daniel, Marcus listened without judgment, offering neither excessive sympathy nor unsolicited advice, simply the steady, attentive presence that had drawn her to him from their very first meeting. Meanwhile, Daniel's own process of change continued in parallel, though he remained unaware of Marcus's growing presence in Claire's life. He had reduced his work hours significantly, delegating major projects to colleagues he had previously been reluctant to trust with important responsibilities. He continued his individual counseling sessions, slowly building a deeper understanding of the patterns that had led to his marriage's collapse. He reached out to Claire periodically, careful not to overwhelm her, sending occasional messages checking on her well-being, without pressuring her for a decision about their future. Claire responded to these messages politely but briefly, appreciating his restraint, even as she remained uncertain about what, if anything, she wanted their future to look like. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after she had moved into her new apartment, Daniel asked if they could meet in person to talk, not about reconciliation specifically, but simply to check in honestly about where things stood. Claire agreed, choosing a quiet park near her new home as a neutral, comfortable setting for the conversation. They sat together on a bench, overlooking a small pond, and Daniel spoke more openly and honestly than Claire had heard from him in years. He told her about the letters he had written but never sent, about the individual counseling sessions, about the specific realizations he had reached regarding his own patterns of avoidance and emotional absence. He did not ask her to come back immediately. Instead, he told her that regardless of what she decided about their marriage, he wanted her to know that he finally understood, fully and painfully, the cost of his neglect. Claire listened carefully, recognizing genuine growth in his words, growth that felt different from the desperate, fear-driven promises he had made in the immediate aftermath of her departure. She told him she appreciated his honesty, that she could see real change in how he spoke about himself and their marriage now. But she also told him, gently but firmly, that she had built a life in the past few months that felt, for the first time in years, entirely her own, and she needed more time before making any decisions about their future together. Daniel nodded, accepting her answer with a grace that surprised her, telling her he understood, that he was not asking for immediate answers, only wanting her to know where he stood. They parted that afternoon without resolution, but with a mutual respect that had been largely absent during the final years of their marriage. Claire drove home that evening feeling a complicated mixture of emotions, grateful for Daniel's growth, protective of the new life she had built, and increasingly aware that her feelings for Marcus had grown into something she could no longer categorize simply as friendship. In the weeks following her conversation with Daniel in the park, Claire found herself thinking more deeply about what she truly wanted from her future, rather than simply reacting to the past. She spoke at length with Bethany, with her therapist, and eventually, with quiet honesty, with Marcus himself, about the complicated tangle of feelings she carried regarding both men in her life. She explained to Marcus, one evening on her apartment balcony as the sun set over the city, that Daniel had shown real signs of change, that part of her still held love for the man she had married, the version of him that had left notes on bathroom mirrors and driven her along the coast holding her hand the entire way. But she also explained, with equal honesty, that trust once broken through years of consistent neglect could not simply be restored through a few months of effort, however genuine that effort appeared to be. Marcus listened to all of this with the same careful attention that had first drawn her to him, and when she finished speaking, he told her something that stayed with her long after that evening ended. He said that he was not interested in competing with Daniel, in trying to win her through comparison or persuasion. He told her, simply, that he wanted to be present in her life however she needed him to be, without pressure, without expectation, and that whatever she eventually decided, he respected her enough to let that decision be entirely her own. This response, generous and unhurried, helped Claire understand something important about the difference between the two relationships. Her marriage to Daniel had been defined, for years, by her adapting herself to accommodate his absence, shrinking her needs, softening her expectations, waiting patiently for attention that rarely came. Her connection with Marcus, by contrast, felt defined by mutual respect, by space given freely, rather than earned through compromise, by a presence that asked nothing of her except honesty. She began seeing a pattern emerge clearly in her own heart over the following weeks. Whenever she spent time with Daniel, even during their most honest, growth-filled conversations, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a wariness born from years of disappointment that no amount of recent good behavior could fully erase. Whenever she spent time with Marcus, that tightness eased, replaced by a calm, steady warmth that felt, increasingly, like the way a healthy relationship was supposed to feel. Daniel, sensing perhaps intuitively that time was not simply healing their marriage in the way he had hoped, requested one final meeting with Claire, this time at a quiet restaurant rather than the park where they had spoken before. Claire agreed, understanding that some form of closure, in one direction or another, had become necessary for both of them to move forward honestly. At dinner, Daniel spoke with a vulnerability Claire had never witnessed from him before, not even during their most difficult counseling sessions. He told her that he understood, now, fully, what he had lost through years of quiet neglect, that he recognized the version of himself who had prioritized work over her presence as someone he no longer wanted to be. He asked her, directly, if there was any path forward for them, any possibility of rebuilding what had broken. Claire took a long moment before answering, choosing her words carefully, wanting to honor both the genuine growth she had witnessed in him and the clarity she had found within herself over the past several months. She told him that she believed his change was real, that she respected the work he had done to understand himself more deeply. But she also told him that trust, once eroded so completely over 3 years, could not be rebuilt simply through good intentions, however sincere. She explained that she had discovered, in the months since leaving, a version of herself she had nearly lost entirely during their marriage, a woman who deserved daily presence, not just occasional effort born from fear of loss. She told him, finally, with a gentleness that softened the finality of her words, that she had decided not to return to their marriage, that she believed the healthiest path forward for both of them was to formally end what had already, in practice, ended months earlier. Daniel absorbed this news with visible pain, but also, Claire noticed, with a kind of quiet acceptance that suggested he had known, on some level, that this outcome was likely all along. They spoke for a while longer, not with anger, but with a strange, hard-won peace, acknowledging the good years they had shared before things had slowly unraveled, wishing each other genuine well-wishes for whatever came next. Daniel told her he hoped she would find the kind of daily presence and attention she deserved, and Claire, though she did not mention Marcus directly, felt a quiet gratitude that she had already begun to find exactly that. They finalized their divorce over the following months, handling the process with a maturity and mutual respect that surprised even Bethany, who had expected, given the pain of the previous years, a far more contentious separation. Daniel, true to the growth he had demonstrated, continued his individual counseling long after their divorce was finalized, eventually telling Claire, during one of their final, amicable conversations, that the entire experience, painful as it had been, had ultimately made him a more self-aware and emotionally present person than he had ever been before. Claire, meanwhile, continued building her life alongside Marcus, their relationship deepening naturally, now that the uncertainty surrounding her marriage had fully resolved. She did not rush into anything, mindful of the lessons she had learned about the difference between genuine presence and desperate effort. But with each passing month, she found herself trusting more fully in the steady, consistent warmth Marcus offered, without ever needing to be asked. A year after Claire had first walked out of the home she had shared with Daniel, she stood on the balcony of her apartment, now decorated fully in the style she had always loved. Warm colors and natural light, and small touches of art, she had painted herself in the quiet months of rebuilding. Marcus stood beside her, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders, both of them watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold over the city they had come to share. Their relationship had grown slowly and steadily over the past year, built not on grand romantic gestures, but on the accumulation of small, consistent moments of genuine attention, the very thing Claire had spent 3 years of her marriage quietly longing for. Marcus remembered her preferences without needing reminders. He asked about her day and listened fully to her answers. He showed up, consistently, not just during moments of crisis or celebration, but during the ordinary, unremarkable days that made up the majority of any life. And Claire had come to understand that it was precisely this consistency, this reliable presence in the mundane, that constituted real love far more than any single grand romantic moment ever could. She had grown, too, in ways she recognized clearly when she compared herself to the woman she had been at the beginning of this story. She no longer shrank her needs to accommodate someone else's absence. She spoke openly about what she wanted, trusting that a healthy partner would honor those needs, rather than requiring her to quietly wait and hope. Her design career had flourished during this period of personal growth, her confidence translating naturally into bolder, more distinctive work that clients responded to with increasing enthusiasm. She thought, occasionally, about Daniel, not with lingering resentment, but with a kind of distant, peaceful acknowledgement of a chapter that had ended. She had heard, through mutual friends, that he continued to grow in his own right, that he had recently begun dating someone new, approaching the relationship, according to those who knew him, with a level of presence and attentiveness that had been notably absent during his marriage to Claire. She was genuinely glad to hear this, understanding that his growth, whatever its origin, represented a positive outcome regardless of how painful the path toward it had been. Bethany visited often, delighted by the transformation she had witnessed in her sister over the past year, the return of the warmth and confidence that had defined Claire before 3 years of quiet neglect had slowly dimmed it. During one visit, sitting together on the same balcony where Claire now stood with Marcus, Bethany had told her how proud she was, not simply that Claire had found happiness with someone new, but that she had found her way back to herself first, understanding that the relationship with Marcus was healthy, precisely because Claire had entered it whole, rather than seeking someone else to fill a void left by her previous marriage. As the sun continued its slow descent below the horizon, Marcus turned to Claire and asked, quietly, if she was happy, truly happy, with the life they had built together. Claire considered the question seriously, thinking back over the difficult years of her marriage, the painful months of separation and rebuilding, the slow, steady growth of her connection with the man now standing beside her. She told him, honestly, that she was happier than she had believed possible during those long, lonely years of waiting for someone to simply notice her. She told him that his presence, consistent and genuine, had reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten during her marriage, that love, real love, was not measured by grand gestures made in moments of crisis, but by the quiet, daily choice to show up fully for another person, again and again, in all the ordinary moments that made up a life. Marcus smiled and pulled her closer, telling her that he intended to keep making that choice, every single day, for as long as she would let him. Claire rested her head against his shoulder, watching the last light of sunset fade into evening, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and peacefully at home, not in any particular house or apartment, but in the life she had finally, courageously, built for herself. Below them, the city continued its evening rhythm, lights beginning to flicker on across the skyline. People moving through their own lives, their own stories of loss and growth, and unexpected new beginnings. Claire watched it all with a quiet gratitude, understanding fully now what she had not understood during those 3 long years of neglect, that being truly seen by another person was not something to beg for, or wait patiently to receive, but something she deserved simply by virtue of being herself, fully and completely, without needing to shrink or diminish any part of who she was to earn it. And in that understanding, standing on her balcony beside a man who had shown her, through countless small moments of genuine presence, exactly what she had always deserved, Claire finally felt the last of the old ache dissolve completely, replaced by a steady, quiet happiness that she knew, with complete certainty, was here to stay.